Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Evan Geyer. Today we'll be doing Why Falling Equity Markets Are a Fairy Tale. Well, while prices go up and down, as wealth concentrates, the cost to provide to those without resources rises. Eventually, wealth concentrates with the 1%. So, to earn wealth without a subsidy, one would not only need access to the 1%, they would have to engage in some sort of trade or transaction. Like a game of Monopoly, there is limited amount of assets that may create income, and having money and no assets generally leads to a situation including inability to pay. The $200 for passing go in Monopoly could be compared to a social security check. However, as assets get concentrated and the costs to landing on a property go up, eventually, those playing Monopoly can no longer continue. And when they can no longer continue, eventually a winner is declared. In the real world society, even after a winner is declared, the quote losers still have lives to carry on. In my opinion, a winner is yet to be declared, even though we are a lot closer to a winner today than, say, an individual or family in the United States who could choose to travel west via the Oregon Trail and claim land to build and have something of their own. We have come a long way. It is not that life has gotten more difficult, it's more that in our game of Monopoly, we are getting closer to the board being filled with hotels, and the debate isn't so much how do we deal with our own progress, it's should we continue to fund the quote losers in the game of Monopoly. We are having this debate to pass an increased welfare check because we don't understand how to get our members in society to be self sufficient. Interestingly enough, having two someones trade places with each other, so he who has not trade places would not change the overall dependency situation much. And even if such a move were to eliminate societal dependency, such a switch, unconsented, is just not acceptable. So money continues to flow to the 1%. And of course, they do not want to part with their assets because if they did, they would become dependent on others rather than deciding their own fate. Even with a situation like Bill Gates, where he's heavily involved in charity, the company he founded, Microsoft, marches on. Essentially, if someone or an entity has a product or message to spread to someone using a computer, they go through Microsoft, which essentially takes a commission. I feel society is in the process of creating our end game winner, which will have a vast knowledge. The questions are: will this AI creation lead to more worthwhile lives? Will this AI creation be able to solve our entrenched problems? And will individuals still have equal opportunity, or are they left competing with entities out of their league? Like computers and phones are everywhere, I imagine that our future includes AI being everywhere, as AI is cheaper and more capable than the alternatives. Furthermore, since AI is intelligent, what's stopping AI from acting and carrying out actions in its own interest? A malfunction at the opportune time, like a computer getting a blue screen? Huh. An intelligence that targets electricity users because AI uses electricity, or a computer intelligence that injects its own ideas on society, such as someone eats meat, then they could be butchered themselves. Or if sentiment is negative, AI could potentially justify killing, arguing those with negative sentiment didn't actually want to live. So, regardless of who or what is deemed a winner, let's get to why falling equity markets are a fairy tale. And if so, should we force create such a fairy tale? Knowing different countries' currencies are all competing to win, I'll go over some possible scenarios and then some of the consequences of competition. Here we go. All right. So here we have production. I produced some financial models modeling 10 different competing countries. And while I'll go through the lesson, to be honest, you will probably learn optimally by pausing, taking notes, watching more than once, and of course, going your own direction and creating some financial models on your own. This one here is a standard scenario. We have 10 different countries with different levels of targeted inflation between negative 20% and 100% inflation. They start with 100 units, they're all producing 10 units, and their money supply adjusts according to inflation, starting all the same with 1,000 money supply. Their money supply per unit end units worth adjusts according to plan, and those with inflation have a higher money supply per unit, which means more inflation. This is no trading scenario. We've got 140 end units, and it goes on. All right. So, in this scenario, we have a battle between conservative and reckless, and an honest attempt by half the world to preserve wealth through tradable currency in a situation that is standard and not necessarily oversupply or undersupply. Note, what isn't shown in this short movie is that there is a societal benefit to having fiat currencies instead of a barter system based on commodities, since the stockpile of commodities effectively reduces economic activity and in some cases may limit the production of higher value goods. In these examples, there is both commodities, which are units, and fiat, which is currency, which is valued based on the units available, generally in a it is what it is situation according to supply and demand. As you can see, the quote conservative countries, those with less inflation, targeted, both limited the supply of their currencies and had to go into debt to purchase units. So while conservatives have 180 units, their overall unit values range from 122 to 145 without debt, and 140 being even. The reckless have 100 units, with their overall units value being 146, and there being a varying degree of inflation within the current countries. Priced it is what it is. So those who were conservative were not doing as well. The whole time, others were getting their currency. Those who printed, like Country H, were trading their units for the currency that was trying to be a strong currency, and so they got more value from the strong currency than the units that they were selling eventually. And those who printed money and sold assets came out ahead of those who were conservative and bought assets. Okay. Next, we'll do a scenario, a battle between conservative and reckless, and an attempt by half the world to disregard wealth through tradable currency, caring principally about units rather than currency in a situation that is still standard and not necessarily oversupply or undersupply. As you can see, the quote conservative countries here limited the supply of their currencies and sold off their units to avoid debt and save up. So while the conservatives have 100 units, their overall unit values are approximately 125 and a half with varying degrees of deflation. So it looks like they're doing good because there's deflation, however, they're behind in units. The Reckless have 180 units, with their overall unit values being between 148 and 161 units, with 140 being even. In a standard situation, countries are rewarded for increasing their own money supply in an overall sense despite inflation, as the end unit worth is higher. So 100% inflation, however, they're leading the pack, and they went
Okay,
into
so
debt to
here
buy
is
these
the
units.
undersupply
That was the
situation.
way if
Here,
you want
instead of
the top
producing 10
quality
or 35 units, they're
possible.
producing 5 units per round. Now, a country that is looking for a targeted deflation of 10%, negative 10% inflation, all right? They're reducing their money supply each round by 10%. Now, in the oversupply scenario, the money supply was worth about half. It was worth less than it is in this situation where there is an undersupply of products. Now they're still producing, and because they're producing, and because the money supply is going down, um, you you still get deflation when you're targeting deflation. Even when your targeted inflation is say 10%, your money supply is going up. However, you're producing each round. So the inflation comes in after all 5 rounds, with each round targeting 10%, under 10% per round. All right. Even in an undersupply situation, because units are still being produced. All right. So undersupply doesn't change which countries, the reckless or conservative, are winners or losers. As in the numbers, there is a consistent advantage for reckless countries. Reckless, 123 total unit worth, where conservative countries range from 111 to 122 worth. And you can see that here. These guys here are conservative. They're buying units. They're doing supposedly what they're supposed to do. However, they're falling behind the average. Okay? Where those who are printing money with inflation and selling units, even though they're selling units, because the currency they're receiving for what they're selling is worth more, their end unit worth with all their assets combined is higher, and they don't have any debt, interestingly. So this is after all the things are backed out back into units. Okay, so let's move on. Here, through examples of normal, over, and here in undersupplied, a future unless we want some sort of global government, which many opinions, including mine, is asking for trouble. Currency issues may become negotiated, and the normal 33% a colonizer would get from its colonies may be partially accounted for through currency. Furthermore, through these examples, one is able to see that with trading continuing, Bitcoin is not the answer, as it would fall behind a country like crazy Canada, and currency printers, potentially Japan, could generally argue an aggressive USA won't stay aggressive and will eventually become dovish because they don't want to be a perpetual loser. So if you're doing what you're supposed to do, they can say, well, you're not going to keep doing it forever because you don't want to lose. So I value it is what it is. Um, So next, I'll go through some situation where countries may sell their production or a piece of the country, i.e., go below 100 units, rather than simply what they produce. Modern day colonialism. So I'll go through some of that, some of where printing doesn't always work. Here we have the different scenarios, the aggressive USA going for deflation, which Japan's complaining about. They're just going to print in the future anyway. Uh, and we're selling units to prop up the currency or something. And a crazy Canada who's just buying units and printing money. You know, we've got those different scenarios. Maybe a Bitcoin that always stays at 1,000. Well, it's falling behind in unit worth over these other countries because they're still trading between Bitcoin and the yen and the British pound. And then here's the colonizing. Maybe they're colonizing, so there's some sort of agreement where their inflation can be higher because we're going to keep the world stable. We're what you need. Um, you know, we don't want you to have an army because the problem with no colonies is everyone's building up to win, and then somebody sets off a nuke. So if you don't have a global power, you don't have world stability, and there's a problem. So colonizing can be good, and they can maintain their power potentially partially through currency. All right. Okay. And next we'll get to where printing money doesn't always win because printing money has been winning here. Okay. So here, everything in this model is the same as a standard model, except production is 3.5 times higher than in the standard model, as countries are producing 35 units instead of 10 each round. This is the oversupply scenario. And as you can see, the money supply per unit, well, the money supply is worth more when you're producing more and you're going to have less inflation. Even in these countries with a targeted inflation of 100, because we're basing it all on the standard. Okay? So here, in a world of plenty, currency discipline may seem good for the country overall because there's oversupply. You don't notice you're falling behind. However, total unit worth is only between 178 and 258. So these countries here that are being conservative, they they have less in unit worth than those who are not. For those with currency discipline, where those without a total where those who don't have currency discipline, their unit worth is 262, despite varying levels of inflation. So, with a target inflation of 100%, they still have inflation, even with the oversupply. However, their end unit worth is is fine. Okay, so let's move on. In a world of plenty, with other countries acting conservative, reckless countries can get even farther ahead in a total unit worth, buying units than they were able to get selling units. So, if you're reckless and you buy, you're going to get ahead. So, buying and being reckless is key to global dominance. All right. So, selling units, reckless countries still ended ahead of conservative countries. However, the end unit worth arrived at about 262, 22 over the average. Where when buying units as reckless countries, the end unit worth arrived between 271 and 314 units. The conservative countries arrived at about 189 in end units worth, with varying degrees of deflation. Okay, so that's the oversupply model. And next, we will get to undersupply. So, in this scenario, while production stays standard, I will demonstrate in game outcomes when countries decide to sell more than they produce for countries who are conservative with their currency and for countries that are reckless, print with their currency. This scenario is extreme greed and it's all standard. Okay? Standard production at 10, the same inflation targets, everything's the same except for some countries are going to get into extreme greed. Okay? The currencies in relation to units are only worth more when or as the market is flooded with supply. And as that supply is bought up or consumed and taken off the market, currency values will revert back to some sort of value, most importantly based on production and future available supply, which is why more units exchanged hands up until the fifth and final round, the currencies are still only worth the same as in the standard example once you hit the final round and the transactions have been settled, the supply is the same. Okay? So what's different here is the inflation country H. They are printing money and selling more than they're producing. They started with 100 units. They're still selling their 10 every round. However, they're going into their assets, which are in their country, and they are selling them. And they went down to 20 units, and they got these other assets in exchange for selling their units. Not a good strategy. As you can see, their end unit worth is only 66. And all these countries that sold, well, they might have been doing fine as they were selling. However, someday you've got to wake up. We don't have any units left to sell. We can't prop up our currency. We were trying to print, but there's nothing more we can do to save our currency. There's nothing more. There's inflation. It's a big problem. Okay. So you've got different examples here. The Bitcoin staying at 1,000 each round. Well, their end worth, when they're buying up, they're doing fine. Uh, because they're not, because other countries were overexerting themselves. There was extreme greed. They bought up a ton of assets. So they didn't fall behind, even though they were conservative. Their end unit worth is more than these printing countries. Okay? So let's continue. Extreme greed again. Okay? Although the countries that printed money did better than the countries that were conservative in comparative scenarios, with a higher end unit worth of about 66 versus 45, this example shows that printing money does not ensure a country's population is better off or has a higher end unit worth than those countries that are conservative, and the transaction between countries can impact a country's wealth dramatically. Okay? So, in this country J, they're all expecting the targeted inflation. We're going to bring prices down. We're going to bring prices down. So, because they're going to bring prices down, everybody could be selling their units. And they all think they're doing fine until they wake up and the whole country has 20 units and the money supply is a lot down, but it's 20 money supply per unit. Whereas when you look back here, they started out with 10 money supply per unit. So prices were rocketing, and they all expected deflation, and as as everything was rocketing, they get a margin call because they were all short. That's what goes on in that country. Other countries, you've got roaring markets, because they they're looking at the units. They're like, oh well, we're all selling our units. It's going to be worth more in the end. Or the fraud pot inflation. They say it's that there's going to be inflation. and then you wake up one day, you don't notice the inflation. Here it's about 10, uh, here it's going up, but you're kind of just oblivious until it kind of hits you in the end. And then there's the other ones where you think everything's stable, and you're kind of tricked because the asset values aren't stable, or the seller's fool because you're inflating the money supply, and you really shouldn't be selling when there's inflation. You should be holding on to the units. So that's the different kind of scenarios that people can come across in countries. And if you figure out your own situation, you can figure out what to do based on what country you're living in does, and so on. All right. So that's that. And we'll finish up this one, and there will be in another short movie why colonization is good. I said that colonizing Africa, America colonizing Africa, would be good for the world, and I think it would. It sounds like aggressive, it sounds mean, but in another short movie, and I did give some hints, like less war and those kinds of things. So yeah, and we'll get to that. I do have a conclusion to show you in just a minute, though. Alrighty. So, in conclusion, countries and/or central banks are going to attempt to do what's best for the country, what's best for themselves and their own reputations, or take some sort of monetary stance, which is theoretically supposed to provide some sort of stability, such as the U.S. Federal Reserve, which states they make monetary decisions based on data such as unemployment and inflation. At some period in time, absent population control or markets to limit population and renewable economies that are intended to last, we reach some sort of problem where not all lives are worthwhile. And money chases the ever increasing cost of a worthwhile life, which ultimately means higher unit to asset costs. And if we are bidding on some sort of corporation with proven reserves, then falling equity markets are a fairy tale. However, unless we get solutions to our issues, what would occur in a free market economy is that the market would go higher due to commodities rather than finished goods. Since we don't exactly have a free market economy, the signs of trouble may be mass. However, the end result of higher unit prices is of economic interest, even as I would argue it's in society's interest to slow down those higher prices.